Thank you for joining us. As people are coming in, I'm going to go ahead and get the announcements out of the way so we can maximize the time we have to hear from Lee. Welcome to people coming in. As you're joining us, please feel free to use the chat to say hello, to introduce yourself. We welcome a back channel, especially an enthusiastic one, as is emerging on the chat. If you have questions for Lee, I really recommend that you put them in the Q&A, if you don't mind. So questions or comments directed to him in the Q&A, back channel, chatter, gossip, links, hellos can go in the chat. We're happy to hear from you. And we're happy, I'm sure many of you want to hear from one another. My name is Beth Novak. I'm director of the Governance Lab at New York University and a professor of technology, culture, and society at NYU's Tandon School of Engineering. I'm also a fellow at the Institute for Public Knowledge. On behalf of both GovLab and IPK, I want to welcome you to our Future of Democracy lecture series. We have a regular series of conversations that are really designed to address the optimistic side of our democratic future. And I think given the election climate that we're in, we all need a little optimism right now. So we use this series to talk about the impact of technology on democracy and to think broadly and try to reimagine the ways in which our democracy could look for the better. So I'm really delighted to welcome a friend, colleague, and collaborator, Lee Rainey, the Director of Internet and Technology Research at Pew Research Center. Under his leadership, the center has issued more than 650 reports based on its surveys that examine people's online activities and the internet's role in their lives. And I have been told by Lee that in addition to the work on the future of democracy that he's going to talk about today, that any questions about Pew's research on elections is also on the table. So if you thought this was a safe haven from what's going on around us, think again. We welcome your questions about the state of the world, what's going to happen on Tuesday, and what more importantly is going to happen after Tuesday. Lee has reassured me that he will be glad to tell us absolutely nothing about what he thinks, but he will be very glad to tell us about what we Americans think on these topics and to represent Pew's research. The American Sociological Association has gave Lee its award for excellence in the reporting on social issues in 2014 and described his work as the most authoritative source of reliable data on the use and impact of the internet and mobile connectivity. He's the author of co-author of a wonderful book called Networked, the New Social Operating System, as well as 5 additional books. And he's also a very valued member of the GovLab's MacArthur Foundation-funded research network on opening governance, through which I've had the pleasure to spend a great deal of time in conversation with Lee. And so I'm just thrilled that he can join us today. Prior to joining Pew, he was, of course, the managing editor of US News and World Report. Lee, given what's going on Capitol Hill right now with senators grilling tech CEOs from Facebook and Google and Twitter in these highly partisan congressional hearings that we have followed this week, I think it's really a wonderful timing for us to talk about the impact of technology and democracy. And so we're eager for you to explain to us the work that you've done with Elon University and the results. And for those of you who join us normally, we won't do this as the usual conversation. To start with, Lee is going to show us their high impact visuals about the data and results of the work that I'm putting up in the chat and on the screen. He's going to talk to us for a little while. And again, you should please share your questions in the Q&A. What we will then do is have a discussion with him and with the internet. We're streaming live until 6 o'clock. And then at 6 o'clock, we will conclude the formal portion of our program. But I just want to encourage nobody to leave, because that is when virtual cheese cubes begin. And we do our best attempt at imitating wine and cheese by promoting everyone to a speaker and having a much more informal conversation, not in webinar mode, but in a more relaxed mode at 6 o'clock. So please don't leave, although we will stop the stream then, and that's our chance to get all the on the record, off the record conversations in. But with that, again, Lee, welcome and thank you for joining us. And the screen and the floor are yours.
Thanks so much, Beth. It's so fun to be with you. I see a bunch of friends in the participant channel, and so this will be fun. Some of the participants in these expert canvassings that we've done are here, and it's kind of wonderful and nerve-wracking to actually be talking about them to them. Um, what I wanted to make clear to folks is that everything from Pew is on the table. We do a lot of work about the here and now in politics, and I'm happy to talk about that. We actually, just on the eve of the Senate hearing with the tech leaders yesterday, we put out a compendium of data that we've gathered just this year about related to techlash and Americans' dismay in many cases with the way social media companies are performing, the way that they are maybe implicated in democratic systems and the outcome of the election and things like that. So I'm happy to sort of venture into any field that that folks think that is relevant to their lives and that Pew data might be relevant to. And I'll just remind everyone that we self-describe at the Pew Research Center as a fact tank, and so we are not allowed to express our opinions, but we and advocate for our work or do any work that's promoting a particular agenda. We don't do cheerleading for technology. We measure public attitudes about democracy, but we haven't yet declared ourselves doing the business of democracy in our service. So I will talk a lot about what others say and what Pew data say, and that's how I am comfortable and stay employed at a place like Pew, which values its neutrality, its independence, and the non-agenda, non-recommendation part of its work. The core stuff I've prepared here is built around two reports that we issued earlier this year, that were built around canvassings of experts that took place in the summer of 2019. So this is not pandemic-related work, and these are not election 2020 related questions, in the here and now. But we knew that this was coming up. We knew that an election was coming up, and we knew that there was great concern about the role of technology in democracy and its future. And we asked people a series of questions about that, and spent a lot of time coding and analyzing their answers. These are not statistically reliable or statistically robust kinds of findings. These are convenient samples of experts who are willing to respond to us, but they do have meaning. I mean, these are a lot of smart people who have interesting, diverse opinions. It's an international group of experts who are responding to us. And so we feel it has validity, certainly to drive the conversations that are taking place now about how democracy is going to work in the future. A little bit of background on this work. We began it with Elon University, which is in North Carolina. There was the communications faculty down there became very interested in doing this work when I first started engaging them in the early 2000s. And it turns out one of the early folks on that team happened to be a friend of Bruce Sterling, and learned that we were kind of interested about looking at predictions about the internet, and said, well, Pew is known for doing surveys, so why don't you survey experts and see how good they are at predicting the future? And that's why we ended up doing what we've been doing. And we've actually had some pretty decent insights about the way things are going. This is a group that early in the 2000s was already talking about the likely rise and potency of cyber attacks. They were the ones who forecast the shift from a wired to a mobile environment. They were among the first to start talking about filter bubbles and echo chambers. They knew early on that the implications of the systems that were being built in those days had a lot of impact on people's privacy and their sense of being surveilled. They talked a lot about social impacts, like the breakdown of the barrier between home and work as the internet became woven into people's lives. They knew that fringe groups were going to arise and likely be violent, at least in some cases. That was one of the earliest predictions we ever compiled. They talked about the rise of cryptocurrencies before the 2008-2009 Great Recession and the rise of Bitcoin. They've talked for a long time about virtual and augmented reality and mixed reality and how that will become a deeply more integrated part of people's lives. And we've asked them questions about social impacts. Would the internet and its spread and adoption lead to more tolerance or more contention in people's lives? And there are actually split verdicts. About half of our experts at the times we ask questions like this say things will get better. When more people are exposed to each other, when more people learn about each other's lives, good has to come from that. And there's a contrary point of view that half the experts usually cite, which is human beings are constructed a certain way. They are wired for contention and wired for going after each other and doing damage to each other. And these are just going to be a new set of tools and a new set of techniques for moving through those challenges. And since day one, continuing on through the work in 2019, there has been persistent concern among the experts that some of the most exciting potential applications of technology on education and healthcare just have not been realized. Those are two domains of cultural life and national and international life where they lag behind, basically, adoption of technology, innovation, and things like that. Although there are many people now who, in the most recent surveys, when they talk about civic innovation and social innovation, they are certainly excited in both domains. The healthcare piece of it, especially the mental health concerns that people are citing, they think there's going to be a lot of activity, beneficial activity that comes from that. And a lot of people just hold out hope that the disruptions of the pandemic related moment are going to finally move the education industrial complex away from its current set of structures, including higher ed, and move much more towards the system of personalized learning, learning by doing, and things like that they've always thought would have been enabled by technology. So here's the first report we did. We issued it, as you can see, in February, and we asked a set of questions about the future of democracy. Actually, I'll show you what we asked. We got 979 experts to give extended responses, not only answering our questions yes, no, but also giving elaborations on what they were thinking. So this was exciting to do. And the basic question on the table was, will technology used by citizens, civil society groups, and governments mostly weaken core aspects of democracy and democratic representation, mostly strengthen core aspects, or not much change the core aspects of representation? And there was a kind of a split verdict. About half of these experts said mostly weaken, about a third said mostly strengthen, and about a fifth said not much change. And again, these are just numbers of this sample. These are not statistically robust kinds of findings, but it certainly sort of shows the weight of expert opinion and commentary on these issues. And we often break our reports into this sets of themes that emerge in people's written elaborations on their answers. And so particularly on the side about concern about democracy, which was more prevalent than the confidence that technology use would make democracy better, people were very quick to cite surveillance capitalism and the sort of fallout related to that. The basic organizing thought of much of the commentary was that these tools are now being very adroitly used by those in power, both in government and in corporate circles, to maintain the systems in their own power rather than being used for democratic, pro-social kinds of activities. They also lamented citizens' lack of digital fluency and the way they can be manipulated when they don't necessarily have all the time and training to understand what's going on, particularly when it comes to misinformation. And they were very downcast about the way that, particularly in social media, information had become weaponized, that people could be, their behaviors and their attitudes could be sharply influenced by the kinds of information that was sort of being pumped into their own information environments. They also noted that there were a variety of trust issues related to the interplay of technology and democracy. The sort of syllogism that they were working with was that misinformation is sort of the building block of the troubles that democracy was going to face, that misinformation and disinformation were just so prevalent and so easily used by clever folks and by mal-meaning folks, that they would just undermine people's trust, not only in institutions, but trust in each other. And so people talked a lot about reality distortion and the way that the public wasn't sort of equipped to process it, and that it would eventually lead to even less trust in the basic institutions of democracy. A lot of talk about journalism and the problems it was having, and sort of underpinning of a good solid information system in days gone by, and the way that it now is being manipulated to abet tribalism and also to undermine people's trust in basic institutions. And that there was this basic sense that technology and its use was outpacing the capacity of government, of civil society, interested activists to cope with some of the fallout of these variety of issues as they sort of cascaded through the culture. The second survey we did was about tech innovation. And the question we asked there, we got fewer responses because it was later in the survey and people were kind of worn out of giving big answers to the first question we asked. But we asked about, we sort of gave a preamble talking about how civil and social innovation followed the beginning of reckoning over the impact of the Industrial Revolution. That in the late 19th century, and certainly in the dawn of the 20th century, when many of the problems of industrial society were rampant and clear to people, you got a whole series of changes, sometimes enacted in law, sometimes enshrined in norms, sometimes coped with through really interesting and clever innovations in civil society, like Boys and Girls Clubs, like YMCAs, like other kinds of civil societies that were built as the nation was urbanizing and people were moving from tight-knit communities in rural areas into more dispersed communities in urban areas. So you had a lot of ferment and eventually a lot of mitigating innovations that softened the impact of industrial society. And so we said basically, that we're in the middle of technash now. This was the summer of 2019. And our question was, will significant social and civic innovation occur between now and the year 2030? And we gave a definition of what we meant by civic and social innovation. And there was a very large scale agreement that innovation would occur. 16% of these experts said that no innovation would occur. But then we asked a follow-up question, which was, will humans' use of technology lead to or prevent significant social and civic innovation? And it was a little bit more mitigation of some of the enthusiasm, as some people said tech use would help. About a fifth of folks said tech use would hurt innovation. In other words, the misinformation, tribalism, weaponized environment that people were in, that would actually harm any prospects for innovation. And then about 10% or a tenth said that the tech use really wouldn't have a major impact on innovation. And again, the themes that they struck related to things like social media. They do think that social media companies will be in for a reckoning that will partly involve lawmaking and rulemaking, partly involve citizen retreat from the current structure of social media companies, partly related to maybe antitrust activities against the companies, partly related to market responses. There might be a bunch of experts, we're fairly confident, that there would be sort of pro-social, pro-democratic social networking systems, either emergent as platforms themselves or just by people's own sort of use of available technology. And so the market incentives themselves, they thought were pushing against some of the worst abuses now of the current social media environment. They also talk about more regulation related to privacy and softening some of the privacy challenges that people enjoy. They also think that privacy will elevate as a broad public concern. There will blockchain and smart contracts will be more deeply employed to salvage people's privacy or to make sure their privacy interactions with institutions of government and corporate America are more carefully balanced. One of the innovations they talked about, and it's a big innovation that occurred in the industrial era was the rise of insurance reforms, that insurance marketplaces that would protect people or certainly insulate them against some of the worst abuses of privacy. And that the government itself might step in and provide tools that would allow more control, personal control over privacy. And there was a lot of hope, especially since we framed this question as what innovations do you see coming? There was a lot of hope that problems related to misinformation will be addressed. Some of it will come through education systems, both formal and informal, as digital literacy becomes a more preeminent part of people's lives. There will be sort of a technology solutions, sometimes anchored in AI, sometimes anchored in apps that are allowing people to fact check the information that they're exposed to. They think that skepticism will become more rampant as people understand, and particularly after the pandemic, how their embrace of misinformation can do them real harm, so that they think there might be just literally a social change tied to that won't necessarily be enacted in law, but will be in evidence in the marketplace itself. And then that people will get more tools to check the misinformation. And they think, as I'm just going to go back to the person who taught me about this, Beth Novak was among the leaders of thinking about crowdsourcing and crowd innovation and direct democracy kinds of input to all sorts of processes like budget creation, like local lawmaking, like other kinds of budgeting tools and things like that. There will be more, they think there will be more transparency, particularly related to the way campaigns and money is spent in public lobbying campaigns. One of the most interesting innovations that was sort of fresh to me in this canvassing was people talking about online court systems, where particularly on the civil side of law, there might be ways in which people could exploit technology tools to have a much more efficient, much more responsive kinds of judicial system. Deliberative processes will be invented by all kinds of people in all kinds of contexts that they think will allow communities to form and allow people to find each other and deliberate and sort of sharpen their ideas and things related to that. Finally, they talked about artificial intelligence inserting itself into so many aspects of life, but in the context of civil and civic reform, they talked about AI being sort of used as a tool to identify some of the worst behaviors and help people fact check things, help people find their pathway to the right information, find ways to push back against manipulation that might be occurring in there, and just to highlight the high quality information that's coming through. This innovation report just covered a waterfront of material. We just literally cataloged all the variety of ways that people were thinking that innovation would occur, some of which are related to these 5 bullets. And I think that's a sort of speedy race through of the material that we gathered. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen there and figure out what you all are thinking.
Great, Lee. Woof, that was a whirlwind. I will exercise moderator's prerogative to ask you the initial question or two while we give people a chance to paste their questions into the Q&A. And then what we're going to do is invite you to ask those questions. So I have such a long list of things, but I think in light of the fact that the election is on everybody's mind, much as we would like to avoid it, we're just really curious whether, and again, this involves some prognosticating, and I know we want to stick to what other people think rather than what you think, but based on some of the more recent work and some of the election work, we're curious for a little bit of how these things intersect and what we can imagine in terms of future scenarios in the more immediate future. Is there anything that we can say about what might play out in terms of next week, or more importantly, the week after, the views on how tech is being used or could be used to manipulate, or by contrast, to safeguard the transition of power? And do you think that what the tech companies are doing in terms of their decision to limit some aspects of electioneering and advertising is enough, or what might we need to do differently?
There are ways that people talked about the here and now or the aftermath of the here and now that were really pretty interesting. So let's just take it as a given that in the next 5 days, we're going to just have evidence aplenty, according to these experts, about manipulation of the system. There'll be deep fakes, there'll be cheap fakes, there'll be doctored pictures, there'll be photoshopped things, there'll be rumors aplenty that are sort of subsurface. And yet, one of the things that experts say down the line that these tools hand to citizen activists is their own capacity to monitor what's going on, to demand more transparency about what's going on, to watch the people who are watching, so literally election systems themselves under surveillance. And the other sort of really smart thing that any number of people mentioned was that there's probably a way to bottle what the social media companies are learning now about engagement. They know, every day we're giving them a bunch of data points about how we allocate our attention and what captures our attention, and how we react to things that we are fed once we've declared our attentional interests. There's no reason, these experts say, that you can't apply that for good. That knowing that people are out to manipulate people, knowing that they're out to grab attention, there've got to be strategies sort of in the data vaults now, sort of in the hands of some of these companies, again, according to these experts, that would give us a lot of insight about the right ways to push back against the worst abuses of misinformation. The other thing that sort of you and others have taught the world is that there's going to be changes in law that are likely to emerge no matter what happens in this election and its immediate aftermath. People are focused on voting systems almost in unprecedented ways. And so there will be lots of attention, again, sort of anticipating what these experts would say, on the lawmaking that will update, revise, make less vulnerable these systems. And to the degree that people think that the system is broken, you can just see tons more activism and agitation around that kind of stuff. And again, with a sense that the whole world is watching under these circumstances. I mean, one of the things that's been so striking, for instance, in the context of the racial justice protests and activity that's come after George Floyd's murder, is the sense that we're now there are millions of cameras on the street all the time. And that encounters between the state and others are being watched, being visualized, being passed along in ways that are even unprecedented from just a few years ago when similar things were happening in other communities. So there's a sense that the whole process is being intensified, and that people will have tools to organize and to press for changes that will clearly be on a lot of people's minds after this election.
I'm going to ask you one more question, and then we're going to go to our lengthy Q&A, since a lot of people are going to ask you about the democracy questions. I want to ask you to shine a light on the people who answered these questions. What struck me in rereading the report is really how little discussion there was of race or racial equity. Now, the earliest part of this work was done pre-George Floyd, but racial justice doesn't figure very heavily. I'm wondering, from what you know of the 900 and some people whom you targeted, what you can tell us about these experts. Are they overwhelmingly male and white? And at a time when we're very worried about the lack of diversity in terms of who produces the technologies that we use, we're worried about the way that AI and machine learning perpetuate bias. I'm just curious, how would you describe who these people are? I did notice, and you can tell me whether this is true or not from your perspective, that the people who are, let me call them the cyber or internet law professors, tend to be very negative in their prognostications. The policy people and the futurists tend to be more on the positive side. So I'm just wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you learned about the field, and if you're seeing any gaps, like we're seeing in the tech field more generally, about just the need for greater diversity. Do we need more diversity in who's thinking about tech and democracy?
Thanks, Beth, for giving me the chance to say this is more male by a lot than female sample, more North American than anywhere else in the world by a lot. And we don't ask a race and ethnicity question, but I'm presuming that the vast majority are white. And it's a database that we've been building over time. We always ask people to forward this to their colleagues. We made a particularly plea when we fielded a survey this summer to have people invited as broadly as they could. Don't worry about the definition of expert. What we're really looking is people who have smart things to say about the kind of issues that we ask about, whether they're credentialed or not. We would really like to hear from them. The database itself is now 14,000 people, so the 973 is the response rate that we got. And we actually this summer did in our survey talk about sort of life after COVID and asked a very particular question about ethical artificial intelligence. And the answers this year were suffused with commentary about racial justice, that the package of the crises in this culture that have occurred since March are very much all of a piece, and now including the election itself. And so there was lots of, particularly when we asked about artificial AI, just an overwhelming amount of commentary about specific dimensions of AI that are on everybody's mind. Who codes the algorithms in the first place, and how good are the data sets that are being fed into machine learning systems? So that's a top of mind concern, and the people who are quite anxious about the future of AI are very, very clear about those being the most important things to consider and address as the systems are being built out. And there are ways in which this sample is just thinking that all of the activism that they talk about, all of the ways in which this new connectivity, actually new data itself, and the Internet of Things it's a bundle of things that are going to produce a world where smart activists, people who can find others who share their beliefs and the causes that they care about, are just going to have abundant new opportunities now to articulate themselves, to find each other, to galvanize populations and things like that. So that's very much one of the things they're hoping for.
Boy, a database of 14,000 experts in this field. Next time I have to plan a conference, we'll never want for speakers in this series. A reminder to people that closed captioning has been turned on. It started a little bit late. My apologies. Please feel free to take advantage of it. We're going to promote the first couple of people to ask their questions to make this a little more interactive. And I would just encourage you, please, to be brief and to limit yourself to one question. I think Prince coming to us, I assume from Ghana. Let's see, I can't hear. I'm just checking here. Do we have, Sam, have we promoted Prince?
Yes.
There he is. Hello, introduce yourself.
Hello.
And
Yes,
good to see you.
Yes, good to see you, Beth. My name is Prince. I am a graduate student at Johnson Sharama Graduate School of Public Policy, and I'm a member of the Digital Governance Lab. On the slide of the greatest hits, there was the rise of virtual and augmented reality and mixed reality. So I want to know, from your opinion, how do you see virtual and augmented reality and mixed reality being used in civic engagements?
Nobody specifically addressed that in this survey. The way that they talk about it is as a teaching and recruitment mechanism for showing people the world as it could be, or having them consider circumstances that are not possible to consider in their local environment. So there's a lot of commotion around education and the variety of tools that can be used in it. And they think that these will eventually be tools that activists themselves and all kinds of civil society actors will just have at their disposal. They'll be cheap, if not free to use. They will be robust in the sense that they will be able to create deliverables and information and learning tools that are really important. I don't remember anybody specifically speaking of that. The training and education piece is very much top of mind, though.
Okay, thank you.
I think we're going over to Frederick.
Hey, I was just wondering, from like a technical standpoint, if you thought it would be feasible for digital media and modern sociological polling methods to replace representational democracy with direct democracy.
There are a lot of these experts who hope that. And there are communities around the world that are doing a lot of that now. And you know, the way a bunch of them talk about it is in sort of an escalating level of importance. So that the earlier experiments now are on small scale stuff. They're opinion gathering, they're sort of plebiscites, or you know, give me your opinion on this, and it's a really robust tool for local policymakers and for activists to you know, gather a crowd and pass along information to local authorities. Eventually, though, you know, you're gonna, after this election, we don't know to what degree our election systems might have been compromised. God knows that's on everybody's mind. But you know, the technology community has actually been, you know, at the highest sort of inventor level, they've been skeptical about the safety of any technology-based voting system that was high stakes. Literally, who you're going to vote for? Are people you know, going to hold their positions of power because of the votes that were cast there? And so there are plenty of ways that everybody sees these tools as far more robust for gathering public opinion and public sentiment and testing ideas and deliberating and things like that, but not necessarily for, you know, end votes on who's going to serve in office and what the budget's going to be. These experts would say that's pretty far off.
I just want to encourage people to please check the chat, because if you've posted a question, we're trying to reach you to invite you to ask it. But I think now Sam, who's next up?
Noel would be next.
Okay. There you are.
Hi, hello. Thanks, Beth and team. Great work. Lee, I'm glad that you're asking or responding to Beth's initial questions about demographics. Were you able to capture the political leanings, the kind of like the ideological spectrum of the participants? And this another kind of like associated question is, like, many of the social networks are essentially tuned for dopamine, you know, like they really are engaged around getting an emotional response and heightening those emotional responses. Is that really the type of democracy or civic society that we want to have, where we would have a civic digital democracy network that's all about really agitating or getting someone kind of like to immediately respond to the moment without necessarily taking a moment, pausing and reflecting on the moment? So thank you for letting me ask these two questions.
They're great questions. Since these are not representative samples of anything and they're convenient samples, we have never in the past spent a lot of time probing the demographics of respondents, including asking partisanship questions or ideological questions. And in part because we want this to be a global enterprise, we'd have to be asking lots of different variations depending on the country that people were responding from or where they were residents. That being said, I mean, just the flavor of the answers they give is that there's, you know, a heavy contingent of you know, American liberals in the sample, particularly in the professoriate, the respondents. There in the technology community, there's a very significant share of what you know, people who answer as libertarians would. They are focused on markets, smaller government, technology-based rather than publicly orchestrated solutions to things. But there aren't, you know, many Trump supporters in this crowd, and it skews sort of center left probably by the standards of American politics. Sorry, your second question again, Noel.
Sure, it was around the fact that many of the social networks are tuned to really emotional engagement, and that being short, dopamine engagement versus an actual long form democratic reflective hearing somebody out. Do we really want to have kind of like the short form democracy that Facebook has been providing?
These experts would say no. And in a variety of ways, I've already said no. The point that they make, though, is that the best engineers at those companies actually know how to orchestrate attention or potentially deliberation, or actually doing what you were talking about, slowing people down or having them at least consider their judgments or their reactions with a little bit of a pause between them and responding in the world. And so the point that a bunch of these experts make is that we are in the midst of a flowering of insight, both from the technology side and also from the cognitive science side, about what makes people tick. And there's got to be some way for these communities to talk to each other so that, the obviously pro-social, in our case, the pro-civic, pro-democracy dimensions of this get a lot more TLC than the simple measures of engagement that worry you, Noel, and that worry a lot of people, where if all you're looking for is somebody to get annoyed and to respond even angrier than they entered the conversation. We know how, there's plenty of evidence now that kind of engagement can be well orchestrated. And the point these folks are making is, why can't we reverse engineer that and push it in the opposite direction?
Awesome. We're going to go over to Amelia now. Amelia, we can't hear you. Salmon, if you want to go ahead and promote the next 2 or 3 people, we'll avoid the lag. That would be great.
Hi, Amelia. I think you're ready to, it looks like you're ready to go.
Yeah, I'm back. Hi, everyone. Must be a bit slow coming to Sydney, Australia. My question is about the difference between social innovation and civic innovation. In Australia, we don't use civic engagement as much as you guys do, but I'm just wondering if you differentiate between the two and if you think that that's an important differentiation.
I've learned from the social innovators that they differentiate between it, and I just want to make sure we were casting a wide net so that we weren't just limiting it to sort of pure civic kinds of activities, because in many respects, the kind of things that we're asking about don't necessarily have a pure civic dimension to them, but they have wide social implications. How people deal with each other, the power relationships between people that aren't necessarily enacted in public spaces. So the reason we used the term the way we did was just to cast a wide net so that the people who in places like Australia maybe use one term would feel welcome into that response, and people who used another term would also feel welcome into the response. And if you saw the little definition we used, we talked about norms as well as lawmaking, as well as sort of para-civic kinds of activities that are enacted in social spaces online.
Thanks, Lee.
Thanks for starting your day so early.
Yeah.
Appreciate it. Justin.
All right, thank you, Beth, and hello, Lee.
Hey, Justin.
Lee, it strikes me that it's possible that you're one of the experts we didn't hear about in this survey, or hear from in this survey. Your business has changed a lot already as a result of technology. One thing I'm thinking about is low response rates because no one answers their phone anymore. At least I don't answer my phone, so I'm not included in your surveys. Can you speculate about the next 10 years of your work? What kind of changes are we going to see in methods? And I'm not just thinking about using online methods like online surveys to gather information, but are there different mechanisms and methods you might be looking towards in the next decade?
Oh, yeah. Yes, we've seen an enormous disruption in our business. Hardly anybody actually does the kind of phone polling that was a commonplace for generations and a well enshrined activity in civic life. And the response rates just plummeted as cell phones came into being. And And as people just, got tired of answering the phone, especially at dinner time when a place like Pew might be calling them. So there are a variety of ways that people have innovated in our own space. So most of our public opinion work now is done on a web panel that we've recruited through phone techniques, through address-based techniques, through interactions with locally based groups where we know that there are certain populations of people that are hard to reach and hard to recruit through the normal methods. So right now our panel is actually way bigger than it used to be. There are about 13,000 people in it. The normal phone survey from a decade ago was about 1,500 people. So there are lots of advantages now, and we've constructed it in ways that we think are, a representative of the adult population in the United States, just the way that phone polling used to be. But it's different, and we know that, for instance, in certain particularly sensitive issues, people will answer a question differently in a web survey than they would have answered it on a phone survey when they were talking to a stranger on the phone. The people who continue to answer their phones have a really different civic profile from people who won't answer their phones anymore. Their political profile is pretty similar, but the phone answerers are much more likely to be volunteers in their communities, to be engaged with local officials in their communities, to be active in civic groups in their communities, to have interacted with a news organization and public officials. So we're trying to adjust for that. There are address-based ways that we can do recruiting. And there are ways now that people assemble quite solid, good panels through recruiting methods that are not the same as random digit dial phone methods in the future. YouGov is a great example of a highly robust and well-respected system that was put together essentially with the mechanisms of diversity and representation sort of built into the process, whereas the old phone polls just assumed that a random call based on an equal probability that everybody would get that call was going to give you a representative sample. That we're now constructing representativeness in a somewhat different way in some parts of the polling fraternity. And there's the holy grail of the future, which I think some version of it's going to be achieved, is a blended system where opinion gathering in more conventional ask people questions and get their answers way, and other uses of social media, signals from social media, other kinds of data sources that you can gather through APIs and other kinds of elements of the public domain and administrative data and things, that those blended products where a survey and an organic information, unstructured information inform each other, because actually you get a much more accurate result when you do that. Some people lie to pollsters. You don't get necessarily a full insight into somebody when they're purchasing something or saying something, and so they equally well inform each other and are reality checks on each other.
That was a great answer. Thank you, Lee.
I'm going to go over to Tina Tan.
Hi, first of all, I apologize. I'm actually at the gym. I don't know how many people tune in from the gym, but this has been fantastic. So I'm sorry about the visual. Fascinating talk. Thank you so very much. My question is specifically about disinformation versus misinformation, and how the public perceptions of the two may vary, particularly in light of COVID, where we've seen very clear examples of both disinformation campaigns as well as misinformation campaigns. Thank you so much.
So now I'm going to go talk about public opinion polling, because that really speaks to what you're asking. People don't have any distinction in their minds. It's an undifferentiated mess of a system. They don't know what's true and what's not. So they don't know how to sort of say this is actually a lie or this is actually not true, as opposed to this is just meant to stir me up and get me all worked up about something that is totally inconsequential or not even necessarily going on. The sort of most distressing thing that a lot of these experts spoke to about this bundle of information is that the whole aim of it is to confuse and disorient and discourage people. So it's not necessarily to change their minds at all, or not even to change their view of the world. It's just to dispirit them and to make them give up on finding what the truth is, and maybe give up on caring about public life and civic life. And so, in a way, the disinformation piece of this, or the sort of weaponized information piece of this, is somewhat more distressing because it's deliberately targeted at discouraging somebody from pursuing what would be the truth.
Let's go over to Alan, who I believe hails from NYU.
Yes, thank you so much for the opportunity, and thanks for all who are putting this together. It's a great talk. My question relates to our artificial intelligence. Given your conversations and your research, has any of this influenced the, I guess, the professional associations in terms of how there's so many tech companies that were given performative solidarity when it comes down to people actually being moved to make these changes in terms of supporting what Beth, I'm glad she brought up. Do you see how, was there any read into seeing how this might influence sort of the code of ethics within professional associations as they think about artificial intelligence and the responsibility, and how that might, sort of gird the issue of democracy, supporting democracy and through diversity?
Fabulous. Great question. So there are just innumerable conversations now around the world about ethical AI, what the dimensions of it are. And how to enact it. And what seems to be happening is we're still in the conversational stage of that in many cases, but codes are being, the sort of consensus views about what ought to be elements of those codes are shaping up. And there'll be a lot of these experts think that the next 3 to 4 years are going to see a flowering of not only code-based, codes of conduct for how to create and enact and implement ethical AI, and sort of standard setting bodies, but also sort of another one of the civic innovations they talk about is essentially a better business bureau for AI. And so for people that play by the rules get a stamp of approval. There's talk about an FDA for algorithms. And so there might be even a higher level insight and oversight of what's being done. A lot of the most interesting and innovative thoughts in the innovation survey that we did are around how, right now it's the Wild West with a lot of AI, and that there's nobody holding anybody to account, and that, but the urgency of doing it right, and the problems that have already been documented about the ways people get hurt, and the ways judgments about them manipulate their behavior in a bad way, the ways in which they are unfair, are, the body of knowledge now about that, gives a lot of hope to these experts, and the sort of the implementation phase is underway. The other thing that they talk about, of course, is accountability mechanisms just in the marketplace itself. You're going to get civil society groups and researchers who are going to sort of road test algorithms and sort of say these work and these don't, or these are unfair and these are not. So there's a lot of, I hope this is answering your question, but they are really jazzed about what's coming because they know the problems that are already being set in motion.
With your indulgence, Lee, what we're going to do is take 2 more questions before we end the formal part of the program, and then we're going to go into virtual wine and cheese cubes. So I'm going to suggest that both Amelia and then Esther ask the questions, and then you'll take both of them, and we'll promote everybody. So for those of you who didn't get to ask your question yet, please stick around because there will be plenty of time momentarily. Amelia?
Hi. So my second question, thanks for...
Oh, I'm sorry, Amelia, my apologies.
That's okay.
You're the one who got up so early. It's Rachel who I believe didn't ask her question yet.
No problem.
Second questions. My apologies. Your squares, you literally just swapped squares, so that's why I'm confused. Rachel, it's you who didn't speak yet.
Thank you. And Lee, thank you for this research. And it's interesting. I have background in technology and innovation, and now I work in online community management. And one of the things that I'm seeing, I was surprised when I read the report that it didn't dig in more onto the side, but I'd be interested if you have data on this, which is the fundamental architecture of social systems. And what I mean by that is all social online engagement kind of get bucketed in the same thing. And I've found a real difference between threaded social media, think Twitter, versus a group or a community platform where there's shared space. And it really impacts the behavior of people, but you can't see the behavior of people because the databases are all architected around content rather than relationships and behavior. And I wonder if you've done any work to try and understand that, because I think part of the answer lies there.
Gosh, brilliant.
Do you want to take that, or you want Esther to ask her question, and then you'll answer both?
Sure, but thank you, Rachel. We're going to talk.
Okay, Esther, are you there? I don't see you. She's in the chat. Okay, I'll tell you what, since I don't, oh, wait, there she is. Hang on.
Esther.
You should give everybody a test in how well they use these technology. I'm just curious how much you got into this whole misinformation thing, and how you find it. There's misinformation from bad sources, which is kind of like cancer. You can recognize the cancer, or there's another way to find cancer, which is to follow the metabolism. Look at the flow of sugar, which is basically what a PET scan does, and you recognize it by its behavior. And so regardless of the source, the behaviors like posting 24 hours a day, or sudden, it's just, there's behavior that's clearly robo versus human behavior. And the purpose of all this is not, like the people from outside, they don't want either of the guys to win. They want it to be a draw, and they want to destroy the society rather than build either particular version of it. And I'm not sure that we quite understand that. We see them as being purposeful, but they're really just destructive.
In a very weird way, both of these questions are connected.
I knew that. I knew.
Brilliant.
Of course.
Well, at the Pew level, they're very much tied together. So, Rachel, in your question, one of the reasons we have not been as careful and intentional in studying the thing you're describing, it's definitely there. It's definitely possible to measure it, but there are existing schema to do that. We've been reluctant, a place like ours, nonprofit, non-recommendation, to unpack the ecosystem at the level that at the structural level that you're talking about, because it seems like it would be market research, and we don't want to issue Pew reports that move markets. And yet, it's clear now that the thing you're describing is a real thing, and it isn't, there are greater virtues to unpacking it now than shying away from doing something that might be seen as market research. And so this is something we're actually actively discussing about how we're going to go after it, because it's going to be a big potential change for Pew, and we want to be prepared ourselves, and we want to be smart about trying to be.
We have some data if you'd like. We have the community side of the data if you're ever interested in chatting about that.
Yeah, so we're going to follow up, because I bet you can teach me how to think about this in ways that feel safer rather than less safe. Esther, you're exactly right that studying this at the level of the PET scan is the right way to do the diagnosis and things like that. We feel that our value proposition in the world is at the level of public opinion via survey. So we've got a data science unit now up and running, and it's getting its sea legs and has done some really nice stuff. We're probably a while away from doing the kind of work that I think you're suggesting. And there are other places that are doing, Berkman Klein Center at Harvard is doing fabulous snapshots of the ecosystem in ways that are super revealing. The Oxford Internet Institute, same, Philip Howard's group over there. Beth, help me, the Citizen Lab in Toronto, it does just first-rate forensics on all this stuff. So some of that work is getting done, and I feel like we're the monks who are trying to understand what the printing press has done to us. And it's such a big mind shift that we're just now trying to figure out what tools we're going to use. But I am agreeing with you. That's our aspiration.
Ooh, with that,
Yeah, I was just curious whether you had interviewed the people you interviewed about this, but
not at that level of detail.
Yeah, okay.
And it's a great idea.
I by no means want to cut off the discussion, and quite the contrary. Please don't leave if you're here with us live. We're going to now promote everybody to panelists. That's the advantage of for showing up in the Zoom as opposed to on YouTube. But for those of you who are joining us on YouTube or on the Twitter live stream, we thank you for joining us. Please do, we're going to post in the chat link to sign up for future IPK, Institute for Public Knowledge, and GovLab Future of Democracy events. And we thank Lee and Pew Research very, very much for the conversation. Live stream will be archived and posted. So thank you to the InterTube audience and for